Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar on resilience in times of war. My name is Ursula Kopp. I'm part of the team of the Institute for Managing Sustainability at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I'm your facilitator for today. We are particularly fortunate to have two distinguished speakers with us today who approach the topic of resilience from very different but yet highly complementary perspectives. One rooted in complexity science and systemic resilience, the other rather in economics and geopolitical realities. Together, they will help us better understand not only the immediate consequences of war and disruption, but also what it takes to build resilience in an interconnected world. I will introduce Peter Klimek and Stefan Fink in a minute. But let me first hand over to Professor André Martinuzzi, the head of our institute and coordinator of the Diligence Project, to welcome you all.
Good morning, good evening, good night, good wherever you join us from. I think many of you are from very different countries and we are all affected by similar events. When we look back several years, there were some very limited supply chain crises that affected a small number of companies, several supply chains, and it got bigger and more severe during the last 5, 6, 7 years. I remember talking to some industry high-level experts saying, okay, this was a crisis, but now we get back to normal. It seems as if this is the new normal, that we live in a completely different world order where crisis is permanent. If it's the Ukraine crisis, the Iran crisis, and we don't know what crises lie ahead. What does this mean for supply chains? What does this mean for industry? What does this mean for Europe and for resilience? This is why we're running this webinar today, and we're looking forward to very interesting debates. This is part of the Diligence Project. The Diligence Project I have the pleasure to coordinate started a little bit more than a year ago. Our mission is to help you as companies to implement successfully due diligence in mineral supply chains. The Due Diligence Project, if you go to the next slide, please. Yes. Already developed the so-called digital one-stop shop. This one-stop shop is for beginners and for professionals, so for companies that for the first time try to implement measures and go through the different phases of due diligence checks, but also for professionals. It helps you to navigate among the hundreds of regulation standards and digital tools. I don't know if you know how many digital tools are out there. When we wrote the project proposal, we thought a few dozen. We end up with more than 300. So basically, if you have a problem and you think you can push the button and solve your problem, more than 300 digital tool providers will show up at your office and tell you, buy my tool, implement my tool. It's the best one. Well, basically, we collected them, we screened them, we analyzed when we tested them, and we provide you with comprehensive information on the usability, the maturity, and technical and methodological aspects of these tools. And we also developed an easy self-check that you can use on this platform. So that's a digital one-stop shop. Aside of this digital one-stop shop, we also want to promote companies with more in-depth information, which is basically a series of webinars. We also conducted interviews with high-level experts on their practices, on their success factors, and there is more to come in the next upcoming months. Yeah, that's all about the Diligence Project. It's a great pleasure to coordinate it and to implement it with such outstanding partners as EIT Raw Materials, World Resource Forum, WWF. Basically, you know most of them. KPMG will also be represented today by one of our two keynote speakers, BRGM, Solidarity, and so on. You probably know. I don't want to go into details. I don't want to spoil your time with introducing the partners, but I can tell you, working with them, great experience. So without any further ado, let's give the floor to our experts and back to Ursula Kopp. Thank you.
Thank you. For today, our third speaker, Mr. Hollensteiner from the Austrian Ministry of Finance, unfortunately had to cancel, but we will try to invite him for one of the next webinars. This is our 6th webinar in the series, and there will be more. As always, the webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards, as well as the slides. Feel free to post questions and comments in the chat at any time. Our first speaker, Peter Klimek, welcome. He approaches resilience through the lens of complexity science. As associate professor at the Medical University of Vienna and faculty member at the Complexity Science Hub Vienna. He studies complex systems and how they respond to disruption, whether it's public health, critical infrastructure, financial systems, or societies at large. By most Austrian, I think he's known from TV, as he repeatedly explained the complex dynamics during the corona pandemic to us. And as the leader of the Supply Chain Intelligence Institute Austria since 2023, he also looks deeply into supply chain dynamics. We are very honored to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
So I will tell you about some ongoing work that we're doing at the Supply Chain Intelligence Institute in order to understand the resilience of supply chains. So the brief outline of the journey that we're going to do now is I will first try to make clear to you what is the concrete research gap that we think is critical to address within this field and that we want to address with our research. I will then show you a little bit the nuts and bolts of this with a concrete example, namely on production networks of critical raw materials and how we believe that new modern AI augmented statistical approaches can be used in order to gain more insight into this. We will then try to go even further, namely by bringing this down to the company level. And then at the end, in the last part of the talk, I will try to make this more practical and show you how we're using the systems that we are building, for instance, in the current crisis around the Iran war, but also some other applications depending on how much time we have left. And at this point, I take the liberty to please ask you to ensure if you're muted because there were some noises. But let's jump right into it. I think my expectation is that most of you, I don't need to sell on the importance of critical raw materials and the value chain dependencies that they are embedded in. With this slide, I just want to get one message across. It was already said, we live in a time of geopolitical turbulence. Crisis operations have become more or less the normal mode of operation to some extent. And in many of these events, it's the critical question surrounding this is that you need to know who needs what for which purpose. And if you now look at the Hormuz blockade, yes, we know which kind of materials, which kind of products are going through there. But the question is, okay, how will this percolate through the value chains, and at which point will we really start from going to price spikes to physical shortages in specific industries? And of course, the same story could be told with different protagonists. And in other recent events, some of them are listed here. And in all of these cases, we need to know at the end of the day who needs what for which purpose. And our claim is, and also after working with this for quite some time, that we don't have tools to do this systematically, comprehensively, at least not on a level that is often needed in order to get to where exactly the risk lies. Before we go into this, let me set the scene by giving you a bird's eye view of how our dependencies have developed. And as with most of this presentation, I will take a European and EU perspective. So the first thing that we did when we started trying to put this into numbers is to try to look at the data and tools for assessing risks in supply chains that are already there. And I think this gives a little bit in the mood of what's going on here. So what we use here is basically trade data on across 6,000 product categories. That's your standard BASI trade data on an HANMES system code. And what we do is that for each of these product categories, we use a set of indicators that captures different aspects of risk. So when can you be at risk, or when are we in the European Union at risk for a specific product? Well, if certain factors combine. One is the exposure. That means we have a high dependency on imports of this product relative to our domestic production. If the concentration is high, that means we have only a few supplier countries. And another indicator that we developed that is more network aware, we call it the systemic trade risk. What this indicator basically does is it traces the sources of the flows in these products in the global networks, and looks if much of the global sources of a material are concentrated in a geopolitically unsecure region. And what we do here is then we take all of these indicators and then we look at them. Okay, if we now combine them with a single indicator, in which of these products do we have an increase in risk over time, or how many products score above the average? If we do this at the EU level, then you see this picture that we see here. So out of this, all of these products, we find an above average or above risk score. Yes, for a number around 2,200 around, with a slight increase. The exact number doesn't matter so much, but what is important here is the trend. The other thing that we can show here is what are the regions to which most of this exposure comes from. And then it should be to little surprise that, for instance, China is here, the region where we have most dependencies, followed by US and then other regions. So just looking at the non-EU regions. It gets a bit more interesting if we look at this into specific product categories. So here we look at these indicators and how our dependencies develop just for green products. So products that we need for the green transition, at products that we need for renewable energy products, and for dual use products. And there you see in all of these categories, our risks have steadily and strongly increased over the last couple of decades. Those are the 34 critical raw materials. Here, the risks have actually decreased. So this is maybe a bit contrary to the perception that we have, that risks and in certain raw material value chains get more and more concentrated. Yes, but there is a but, and you need to carefully locate these risks. And this is what I want to show you a bit in this presentation of why we have this divergent trend. That on the one hand, it appears that our critical raw material dependence is actually going down, but the dependencies in our strategic products are going up. Before we go into this, so now let's put this a bit on a higher level. So where is the gap that we try to address in our work? If we look at how, for instance, risk assessments in critical raw material value chains have been done so far, then I think there are about 3 types of approaches that you can distinguish. One is manual research, desk research, expert knowledge. You have an expert who knows raw material inside out, who knows the chemistry involved, who knows all the production recipes, all the industrial processes needed for that. The issue with this is, well, perfect if you have it, but these approaches do not scale. And if you want them to set them up, you have long lead times in order to develop this expertise. The other thing, and that is basically the approach that I just showed in the previous slide, is that you use trade data. This scales up, it's comprehensively available, but there's no information on production typically in these data sets. You miss the domestic markets. You need, of course, firm level dependencies. All of this you can't resolve if you use just aggregate national trade data. The economists among you, they will be well versed with multi-regional input-output tables. This is where you can trace dependencies across sectors and across regions. But the downside of this is that you have relatively low sectoral resolutions. So here dependencies are often between sectors. So think about the dependency that you have between the automotive sector and the electronic sector versus the actual dependency that we have, for instance, BMW on Xperia chips. So these are dependencies that are on very different levels. And our claim is that exactly these dimensions of product specificity and necessity, this is lacking in most of the current risk assessment approaches, and this is what we try to tackle. So let me give you a flavor of what we're doing. So the idea is that we want to build such networks of dependencies on a product level and also on a firm level by basically making use of the fact that we have now access to very stupid but very cheap experts, namely AI. So what we try here is to use some of the more menial tasks to break it down into forms that they become manageable enough for current state-of-the-art AI models and LLM models, and then do this at scale. Before I go into this, let me say up front, we know that we won't be able to match with this the level that a human expert has who has worked in this field for decades. That's not the aim. What we want to do is we want to be fast and we want to be comprehensive and systematic. So how does this work in concretely? So here's an example that, for instance, for tungsten, this is joint work for a project that we're doing at the moment with the OECD. So basically, we start with so what we want to do is we want to know from a certain raw material what is exactly the path through all intermediate products that you get for a final product. So for instance, if you know that rare earth, you need them for permanent magnets, yes, but how? What are all the steps in between, and what do you need to do in between for all of the steps? Or if the lithium goes into the batteries in EVs, what are the steps in between? What about the cathode materials, anode materials, and so forth? And what basically the strategy in a nutshell is that we generate a network of input-output relationships between products based on querying a large language model. And we do this multiple times. Why? Because if the LLM hallucinates, it gives a random answer. So if you repeat this very often and you make a statistics over multiple responses, then you can adjust for this. And then we do some statistical filtering. I'm not going into this now. And then we validate it against the manual researched ground truth. And we see that with a combination of the steps, it starts to make sense. So this is what you get then at the end of the day. I show you two examples that we constructed for on the left-hand side is graphite, on the right-hand side is tungsten. And then you get each node here stands for a product. So at the top of this network, you find the raw materials or the minimally processed forms of this raw material. And then you go via intermediate products. So you see here which products input for which others to the final products. And now you can start to evaluate along this production network. So these are basically input-output networks on a product level. How do different risks develop there? Again, just to give you a flavor of the main results. So here we looked for EU countries and looked at the changes in some of these risk indicators that I showed you earlier. How these changes were taking place on different levels of this network between 2007 and 2023. So here each line is a critical raw material. We have tungsten, rare earths, lithium, graphite, germanium, and so forth. And if it's a red arrow, it means the risks have increased. If it's a blue arrow, it means risks have decreased, basically. And what you see here, without going into too much detail, you see that at the higher levels, for instance, for intermediates, for final products, and on some level for processing, most of these risks are going up. That means what we see on the global level that our dependencies state only increased a little bit, masks a dynamics that is going on below the surface, where the risks have basically shifted from the extraction processing level to the intermediates and final products over time. You can do this then finer and finer. So here's, for instance, an example that we did for rare earth. And here some of them are annotated. So for instance, these are the processed forms, and the color here is how high the EU risk level is for this product. And then you see, for instance, that we have also risks concentrating downstream here. These are the permanent magnets. These are photosensitive sensors, for instance. And knowing this kind of networks has immediate consequences, because if you now want to, for instance, diversify, the immediate consequences of this is, well, you need to think this about the whole supply chain. Or if you just diversify in, say, permanent magnets here, but you have these dependencies on all of these input products that you need for this, then overall your value chain for for this entire product hasn't become much more secure. We've did some further research using these networks, which I'm not going into detail now, but basically you can show that if countries have a high dependency in input products to products that are typically export strength of these products, that this is detrimental to the ability of this country to develop new export strength. So you can really see that these dependencies have an impact on the trajectory of countries also in that sense. Now let's go one step deeper. So now that we know who needs what you need in order to produce something, now let's ask, can we say more about who is doing this? Who are the companies that are underlying this? Who are the bottleneck companies? And the idea is now that we start with this knowledge of this input-output relationships, and now we try to identify companies that are underlying that. Again, for the sake of time, I mean, we have some preprints out there. If you're interested in them, just ping me or look it up on our website. But I'm just giving you the main idea now how this works. But basically, we combine here commercial business data sets and then LLM-based classification to identify companies. So basically, if you want to know who produces something, one thing that you can do is you can go on the website of the company and look it up. Who are they doing this with? Who are the customers? Who are the references of these companies? And again, this is something where LLMs become now handy and allow you to do this at scale. And this we then combine statistically with official trade data in order to have it aligned with the official statistics that we see. And what we then produce in this way are statistical reconstructions. So that will be crystal clear here. So these are statistical reconstructions of plausible firm networks. So that means this structure then looks like we see here. So we have different. So we have different products. These are the layers here. We have countries in them. We identify which company uses which input in which to produce which output. And maybe it's clearer if I show it here on this picture. So this would be then a reconstruction for the tungsten network, where we identified extraction companies for tungsten that link them to countries that process to companies that process tungsten and the countries where they are located in and on to the intermediate products and so forth. And now you can do similar risk assessment on the country levels, on a product level, on a company level, in order to identify bottleneck companies. Actually, earlier this week, we published a preprint where we use this methodology for the semiconductor industry. If you want to have more details, you can also look into there. Just one main finding that we see is that these risk assessments can change a lot if you use this company information. So, for instance, what we see is that using this company levels, countries that are often the extended workbenches of other regions get a higher importance or centrality, so to say, in these networks than if you just follow official trade data. On the other hand, trade hubs, for instance, like Netherlands or the Singapore, then get less important if you add this production information, which I guess all makes sense. In the last section of this presentation, I want to show you now, so these were now our research applications. And as I said, one of the reasons why we're doing that is to have something that is fast and readily available to use it in crisis situations, and then to use this in order to get quickly an appraisal of the situation where risks in the supply chains might be located. And I want to show you a little bit how we're using the systems now currently in the Iran war. Because one of the things that we took care of is that this is a framework that is industry agnostic. So that means we can in principle apply it to any kind of industry or to a broad range of industries, of course, always with limitations, but yes, we've already had this. And we're doing this because currently as a member of the task force in the Austrian Ministry of Economics, where we are monitoring the situations and have to produce regular reports about potential situations in supply chains that might arise. And now I want to show you how we put the systems to work there. So this is now the situation where there's some kind of a report or somewhere someone says, yeah, we could have an issue there. Then everyone gets nervous and says, okay, but is this really problematic? And then this question might get on our table, and you are supposed to give a good answer or a reasonable answer to that within, say, a day or 2 days. What do you do then? And that is what we can do with this kind of system. And the example that I want to show you quickly is about concerns about the PPE value chain, and particularly how they might affect pharma packaging or medical supplies. For instance, one way, plastic products like syringes, catheters, IV bags, and these kind of things. And this is also a bit of a lesson from the pandemics, actually, because very often it's not a super complicated product, but for instance, the packaging products, where maybe some even specialized or very specialized or certified input products are needed, where these kind of issues arise. But I will show you a little bit also later of some other assessments that we did using that. Anyhow, the approach is the same. What we do is We know which kind of products are exported from the affected Gulf countries. We now look which countries import upstream products from this region, use them in order to produce another product, like for instance a syringe or some other plastics product, and export them to Austria or the EU or to any other region. And then in that case, the company information is relevant, because what we can also monitor here, of course, is companies that declare force majeure, and then give an indication of how likely it is that these force majeure declaring companies are indeed part of these value chains where there might be a contagion channel to us. And we can, of course, do similar analysis and did similar analysis for other impacted goods. There were some talks about helium, about sulfur, sulfuric acid, in particular fertilizers and so forth. So here is then what the result is on this, just to give a little bit of an impression of what's going on here. So what we show here so these are the Gulf countries. The flows in reds are the export streams in countries in products that are upstream products for packaging and plastics. So these are each node here is one of this product that is exported from this region, which is then sent to different regions. Those are given here, and where they're used in order to produce a different thing. So for instance, here are the syringes or dental instruments, and then you can trace this back, how much of the exports in this product come from one of the country that is in turn dependent on Gulf-related imports. And we can put this in relation to the non-Gulf affected imports, and then you can get an exposure score, how important these particular value chains are in order to supply a given region. So this gives us, so to say, the structural vulnerability, and then we can look at, okay, so where do we have, in which product categories do we have the largest indirect exposures that somewhere else on the globe, a producer might miss an input due to this war. And this is exactly what you can answer here. The next step, as I mentioned, is to make this a bit more concrete. So here is an overview of force majeure declarations that we picked up that might play a role in these value chains. So they are it's not rocket science, but just to make the principle clear, you look at, okay, these companies, which kind of products are they producing, and in which regions are they located, and then you tag basically this value chains if you find the one of these companies. And by this you can make a risk ranking, so to say, of what are potential supply chains that could affect now Austria, because they have a high Gulf exposure, because they're already force majeure declarations, and these are things that should be monitored more closely. As I said, we do this for a couple of products. Here's a quick overview to summarize this in a nutshell. As we all know, but at this point, is that we have limited direct dependencies on the Gulf region, but there's on the one hand the price shock, but then there are some indirect dependencies. We could talk a bit about sulfur and sulfuric acid, but this is maybe even more indirect. If you would put me on the spot and ask me where I would, based on all this work that we did, where I would put my money on that it's the first time that we really that shortages could become an issue, then I mean, and that's also the reason why I picked it. I would say specialized packaging products that require plastics might be one of the ones that where I would put my money on, that this is where this becomes acute first. Again, unless specific actions are undertaken. So if now, for instance, a producer of one-way gloves in Malaysia is not able to produce this anymore due to the cost pressures, well, action should be undertaken either to diversify or to talk with the governments there in order to subsidize what they produce before we run out of gloves in Austrian hospitals. Picking this example also because, for instance, 1/3 of the gloves that are imported to Austria are sourced from Malaysia, and we know that they have force majeure declaring companies that in turn source from the Gulf region. Again, when will this become an issue? How long are what are the inventories of these companies? Based on this, of course, you can't tell, but you can give this kind of structural risk assessment and what are the most likely contagion channels. This is what you can get here. looking at the time, I still have a few minutes, so I just want to give you a flavor of what else you can do with the system without going into any detail. We are not constrained to, as I said, to look at critical raw materials value chains. One thing that I find particularly interesting is to look at the emergence of circular value chains. We're doing this in the energy intensive industry. What I see here is a monitoring that we do, to which extent steel producers and OEMs set up circular production relationships, meaning pre-consumer or post-consumer buyback schemes. And you see now with the increasing adoption of electric arc furnaces across Europe, more and more companies are shifting to such models. They are proud to tell you that they are in circular production relationships, and this is something that can be monitored. I mentioned a study that came out earlier this week where we apply this to the semiconductor industry and how the semiconductor network has developed over time. If you have interest in that, just ping me. And yeah, with this, I'm already at the end. So conclusions, as I tried to get across here, a proper risk assessment of critical raw materials, you really need to take a value chain perspective into account, because what we see is that this is where the risks have shifted, with China being now less complementary to Europe than it was decades ago. Also these dependencies have shifted. And our approach to tackle this is to basically have approaches that make best use on one hand on the official statistical data that is available, and to augment this with new AI tools. What we find then is that developments are, of course, heterogeneous across critical raw materials, but overall, this kind of systemic risk have been growing in recent years, and particularly in the upstream, in the downstream segments of the value chains. What does this mean? As already said, critical dependencies are shifting. We have few companies in Austria that need rare earth as such, but they require intermediate products like permanent magnets. But that also means that if you want to de-risk, you need to take this value chain perspective. I think it's important to get this company perspective, because it might change where the risks are actually concentrated. There's further work needed on that, but I think that's a challenge that remains and that we need to tackle in the research community. And of course, there's much to do in making the stuff that I showed you more mature. Particularly, I'm intrigued by making this closer to material flow analysis, and then trying to combine and merge some of this data-heavy fields in, say, input-output production, network modeling, and material flow analysis. And I think here we now can see a development where this is getting closer and closer to each other. And there's, I think, a lot to be gained here in order to better understand risks and resilience of these networks. And with this, thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you very much, Peter Klimek, for this very interesting insight. I'd like to ask you one question immediately that came from the audience, that says, how do these sometimes complex insights reach product value chains and relevant industries? And are you also engaging with them on measures to prevent shortages?
Yes. So the work that I've shown you today, most of this we did with public sector stakeholders. So the presentation would have been different if I would have told you. So what might be more of interest for companies? I mean, and I think to keep it short, the issue is always the same. I think you have little to do as a researcher coming in and telling companies how their value chains look like. They know this better than you. However, what I think where there is something which is often of interest for them is that they know their own value chains much better than we can ever know with any of the tools that I've shown you here. But this is embedded in a larger picture. So what are their competitors doing? What are further removed across further tiers dependencies? In which directions are technologies or new partnerships developing in other regions? I think all of this is then information that might be more relevant for companies. I didn't go into much detail here, but one example, for instance, was this for the energy intensive industries that I described. So this is a collaboration with an Austrian steel company, and they are interested for exactly this reason because of course they're seeing that more and more electric arc furnaces are built. They know that more and more of these producers will need scrap, and high quality scrap with little copper pollution fueling these arc furnaces, and where can you get this from? Where can you source this from? And what are plans in other regions to source this from? And where's a potential to source it from in Austria, also taking into account not only the status quo of the system, but building simulation models that allow you to look at how will the system look like in 5 years or in 10 years. And this is, I think, one of the areas that we identified where this can also become relevant for companies. Yeah, as I said, the other approach, trying to explain to companies how their value chains look like, I don't think that this is time well spent.
Thank you very much for now. If you can stay until the end, we'll see if we have more questions and answers towards the end. But I would like to switch over to our second speaker, Stefan Fink, who arrived as the chief economist at KPMG and professor at the University of Applied Sciences, Upper Austria. He closely examines how geopolitical tensions reshape supply chains, markets, and broader economic developments. His work helps organizations understand how uncertainty translates into economic risks and what resilience means for business operating in an increasingly fragmented world. Stefan Fink, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for your time, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and for the invitation to contribute a little bit from the perspective of a macroeconomist. So I think compared to what we just been hearing, it's a bit more on the macro view, and really a discussion that's going on. So it mixes a bit the role and also the research component of from an economics point of view with risk management. So I think this is the core tendency that I'm observing at the moment, is that when you're discussing with banks, and I had such a discussion this week when it comes to how to tackle uncertainty, and even if you're dealing with financial markets, is that most of the risks that you see are arising from supply chain risks. And what I brought here is a bit of kind of tackle through. It's a mixture of theory combined with current practice. Having the lens of macroeconomics on the supply chain, I think that from an economics point of view, everything is highly optimized, and exactly this high optimization brought the fragility in the systems, because this just-in-time, the specialization, the cost efficiency, this focus, this taking the risk of a risk cluster was the strength, and of course contributed a lot to increasing wealth that we had. But what we've seen is, and it's more than 3 shocks in 5 years. But I think, considering that is the topic that we are discussing, starting with the COVID pandemic, we have seen something like the global manufacturing halt due to the stops in the production due to the lockdowns, etc. A container crunch. We all remember those ships that were standing at the port of Shanghai, and therefore disrupting the supply chains. Then 2021, we had the famous ship in the Suez Canal, which, with a loss of almost $10 billion per day, we had in this disruption, and we have the current situation with the Strait of Hormuz, where we have energy prices, liquid gas, chemicals, especially fertilizers, which is less discussed at the moment. So these are the patterns, and I'm not talking about Taiwan and China yet, but there is a structural pattern when it comes to assessing the risk, is that each of the shocks reflects a kind of the same weakness. We have a strong geographical concentration that is part, of course, a result to the concentration for economic optimization reasons that has been done in the past. We therefore not have the sufficient amount of redundancy in the supply chains. And what we've seen, especially what we are observing at the moment with the Strait of Hormuz, is this cascade amplification of the threats, because the value chains are even more coupled at the moment. And I think that this is kind of the core. And this amplification is so relevant because here we are discussing with a clear view on supply chains, but this is reflecting in banks' expectations of future default rates, etc., in the respective sectors due to the dependency. So this is a global phenomenon, and when we break it down, for example, for Austria, it hits even more because we are a small economy, we are export-oriented, very energy-intensive. We have a kind of green hedging when it comes to electricity production, but we have a strong dependency, for example, 100% coal dependency, etc., more than 90% in the oils, etc. So you know the numbers. So we are within these European value chains with even a bit of a higher dependency here. And when it comes to the assessment, what does that mean? Of course, you can always switch to other routes, etc. But of course, that comes at costs. We know the Cape of the Good Hope that we have as a hedging for the Suez blockade. That costs time, that costs money. And I think this is something we are currently observing, that hedging and strategy to deal with that costs money. And when we switch to the next one, is how to assess this. So this is not a pure and mathematical stringent theory. This is just kind of a way to make your way through the jungle. How to assess this, how to integrate this basic problem into risk management at first, and via risk management in order to communicate to the board, in order to make better informed decisions. And it's all about transmission channels here. Most important transmission channels is, of course, energy. We have a price shock that then transforms to producer prices and feeds into core inflation. I'm sure you all know the discussion of inflation increases, and as a result, also central bank strategies that might be adapted. And as we've seen in the year 2022, second round effects are a relevant topic. And the second thing is very difficult to model. So when it comes to second round effects, pricing has a very long, inflation has a very long time span from political measures to impact. We are talking about 18 to 24 months here, and that makes it very difficult to assess this from a fiscal as well as monetary policy point of view. We have the second impact here via the intermediate goods, where we have the shortages that may lower production, and that can cause macroeconomic growth drawdowns. The trade routes and the longer transport times and the higher freight costs are straightforward. But what I want to focus on, because it's a bit more my focus of research, are really the expectation channels, of the different expectations about how long does the crisis last, means what will be the future price path of fossils, means what is the impact on the direct impact in transportation, which is fast, the medium term via intermediate goods, etc. So this is a rather complex tool, and financial markets react to these expectations. So you have a process that lasts very long, but you have an immediate impact in financial markets. And ECB is very clear in that point and says, okay, you have to deal with it. And we are clear that we have a negative output shock in the euro area. We have both prices affected as well as output affected. And this is currently, and it's a today's discussion, how will the ECB react to this? And each reaction, might it be fighting inflation at all prices with several rates increases and impact on financial markets, or be it in another way, saying, okay, keep it calm, support the economy at the risk of an escalation in the prices. So this is the field of uncertainty that we are in. But everything that's based on scenarios that you say, okay, I calculate with scenario 1, what's the impact for my corporation? I calculate with scenario 2, what's the impact for my calculation? No one knows the truth, but I see a very strong increase in interest in scenario-based techniques. And this is where basic Monte Carlo simulation also plays a role how to tackle with this, especially also in Austria. Can we switch to the next, please? We all know that the size of the shock, but just I think some numbers. We have 20% in most of the globally traded oil and gas, liquid gas in here. We have 1.2 trillion US dollars of annual trade in these streets and 10% share of the European Union. So I think we are all very aware that although for Austria, for example, when it comes to oil, the direct dependency is very limited, the price implications are what really matters. So we have the price impact and the availability impact at the later stage. And but I think one thing is clear: the unthinkable is possible, and you have to, although it's not very likely that the shortages might occur, you have to come up in your risk management with certain scenarios how to deal with this, and the expectations about that drive the market, and the market drive your finances, and that brings you down to the financial KPIs you have. Maybe we switch to the next, please. Yes, just maybe the next chart. I skipped this one. Let's go to number 5. When it comes to scenario analysis, I just want to give you a broad view of what's the impact we are talking about. So we switched everything, all the investment banks that report their forecasts, etc. Everyone switched not from the point estimate to several scenarios, baseline, adverse scenarios, and severe scenarios. And what is interesting, and that's kind of a development that is also quite new in this situation, we are not taking one risk factor, let this risk factor escalate, but we are much more in this narrative, because it's not one risk factor, it's not only the oil price, but you have the infection effects, you have the correlation of the factors. And therefore, when we look at the severe scenario you see here, yeah, which means that a severe scenario of the Strait of Hormuz might be -2% versus of Euro area GDP, an inflation rate of 6% higher than originally expected. That, of course, is a huge and immense impact. Adverse scenario, a bit slighter, but it always depends on, well, what is plausible, yeah. And I think this is, scientifically speaking, this is one of the major learnings. You don't tackle each risk factor, take an adverse quantile, and you go ahead. You much more look into the potential correlation of the effects. Does that make sense? Can, for example, a huge drop in GDP, taking into consideration a certain level of inflation, considering certain interest rates, does that fit together? And we see much more this kind of integrated risk approaches as we've seen before. But this is just, no one knows, of course, what's happening, but this is the preparation in risk management for this. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I'm not about an elephant in the porcelain shop in here, but I think it's very important also to focus on one thing. Although the probability might be low, the impact of a potential China-Taiwan conflict is severely higher than what we are facing now. And I think this, especially considering the supply chain we have in here. The dependency on the semiconductor, where we have the TSMC with almost all the production of advanced technology semiconductors production in here. But well, you know the examples that are on the slide, but it's when it comes to, for example, for everyone who loves to ride bikes, Taiwan also has a very strong bike component in the trade. And when we think of that 50% of the world container fleet is going there, you have 88% of the big ones going there. You can think of, it's not only that prices are increased, it's also you cut the sales market, the Chinese market. Yeah, and it does not mean that your base strategy as a CEO is to focus on that scenario, but it's important to consider this a risk scenario and have a playbook in case. What are the measures? And I think this is one of the most important lessons learned from this Taiwan discussion. Switch to the next, please. We can skip this. Let's go to number 8, please. Yeah. Methodology, considering the methodology of working with this, what we are doing in the modeling, the macroeconomic modeling, as well as in the risk modeling, we are taking 2 things into account. First of all, the interdependency, and second, the non-linearity in potential developments we have in here. So we have simultaneous stresses in several risk factors, and this is not unlikely. So even if Hormuz comes a bit down, considering the temperature, it might be that tariffs re-escalate in a certain way. We have long-term climate risks that play a role. We have fragmentations. And for everyone amongst you that says now, okay, we're coming into the multi-crisis, one final remark from my side on that is, what we are doing here is we're doing risk management. Risk management means we get some distributions of results on the several parameters, but a distribution always has 2 sides. So as disruptive as the current environment might be, there are not only risks, but only opportunities, also opportunities that arise. This commitment for a more diverse approach, a more resilient approach. When we switch to the next slide, please. Yes, that's it. That's my last thing on that. When you dedicate yourself to diversification, which costs money, but focus on the timeline, focus on the variability of your results, and that you might have a competitive edge when you are more diversified. Think about strategic reserves and nearshoring that has been discussed in COVID. Then everything went fine. We forgot everything again. I think now is the time to really think about efficient ways to combine that, do things together. Yeah, it's an invitation to cooperate between firms that might be supported also from the fiscal authorities. And last but not least, you don't know the future, but set up any kind of early warnings. We have the boards in here. We have the European Stability Board, the risk heat maps. Knowing that something is coming sooner enables you to take sooner actions. And I think this kind of combination, this is what we want to communicate to politicians at the moment, as well as to firms at the moment. Come up with this, do a cost-benefit analysis, but take into consideration efficiency, and cost efficiency is also a long-term project. And there is one forecast, and that's my last remark here, I'm completely sure of, is that times will be disruptive in the future, because for several stakeholders in the world, this disruption is part of their business model. So we can only manage our own decisions and our own strategies, and don't forget about the opportunities. And I think that's in the timeline. With that, thank you so much for listening and for the opportunity to talk. I hope that there were some impulses for you, and back to you, Ursula. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Stefan Fink, for your time and for being ready to share your expertise. That was excellent. I know you told me before that you have an appointment, so you have to disappear quickly.
I'm at the lecture hall. So honestly speaking, I'm facing the students also listening in here. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
They're also joining. Wonderful. Thank you very much, both of you. Andrea Martinuzzi would like to follow up with something directly.
First of all,
and I see some comments and questions there. Yeah.
First of all, a quick reminder to all of you as participants, if you have any questions, please post them into the chat. Although today we will not have so much time to answer them, there is something coming up. There will be another webinar in late June, because we think that this issue of resilience in times of crisis, resilience in times of war, is something that also has to reflect business strategies. We've heard a lot today from researchers, from consultants. So this was a very analytical point of view, but we would like to follow up with some business strategy views. We would like to cover and to showcase what companies are doing. And we think that with more than 120, 130 participants today, we really found a topic that's of high interest for most of you. And we would like to co-create this webinar together with you. We would like to invite you in 3 aspects. First, we would like to know which date suits you best. So there are 2 options. We will post this link into the chat, and you will simply tell us if you would like to attend and which of these options suit you best. And this will be a kind of voting. And at the end, we will run the next webinar on June 21st, 4th or June 29th. Second, which questions would you like to discuss? Post them into the chat. We will try to address them in our next webinar. And if you represent a company today, or beyond today, if you represent a company, would you like to present your company strategy? If yes, please tell us your company's name and your affiliation and your email address. Perhaps we will invite you to this webinar as a speaker. So that's the moment to co-create our next webinar by letting us know which date suits you, which questions you would like to discuss, and if you would like to present your company. And while you're thinking about that and posting into the chat, let me ask 2 questions to Peter Klimek and to Stefan Fink, if he's still here. Simple questions. Just one question. What would you recommend to businesses? What's your top recommendation for businesses in these times? I know you have dozens of them. I know we could have more than an hour. We will have that in late June, perhaps. But what's your top recommendation for businesses and for policy? So there are basically 2 questions. If, let's say, a CEO asks you, what shall I do now? Or a policymaker, Ms. van der Leyen.
Extend your planning horizon. At the core of this is that very often cost effectiveness and resilience and also sustainability, they don't go automatically hand in hand. There is a lot of work and requires a lot of careful and smart decisions in order to make them hand in hand. And of course, an outcome of the supply chains looking like we just described them is that they have been optimized to function under normal modes of operations very efficiently. But the longer the time horizon, the more we take these fat-tailed risks into account, the more also economically reasonable it is in order to think about supply chain resilience. And I think this is the learning from all of this, and this learning to live with turbulence, extending the time horizons, taking this black swans, this fat-tailed risks into your account, and this would automatically lead to a shift where resilience increases.
So basically, this means consider that this is the new normal. It's not short and over and then back to normal. This is the new normal.
Exactly.
Do you quantify these risks in euros or dollars? Do you think it would be better considered if at the end you can talk to a chief financial officer and say, we have an embedded risk of $120 million in our supply chains? If you give it a number?
So the reason why I'm hesitating is because I think the message is to communicate it is that even large companies that we would consider too big to fail, to make it clear, hey, it only needs one freak event and your company doesn't exist anymore. And now tell me what's the value of that? And
yeah, okay.
So that's the nature of fat-tailed risks. Within a finite observation period, we will all live to see events that are extreme enough in order to cause such large damages. And actually, that sentence came not from me, but I took this from one chief risk officer of a petrochemical plant that said this is so to say the central tenet in this, that they say we know it takes only one accident, and we as a company, and it's a large chemical company in Germany that everyone knows, just takes one of these events, think Deepwater Horizon, and yeah.
Okay. On the next slide, you see what we can offer. We have the webinars, and we also have something to offer. Basically, our one-stop shop, as I already mentioned it, charge, just register, make use of it. Our Diligence One-Stop Shop offers so-called deep dive articles, which is knowledge related issues. It offers tools, digital tools for supply chain due diligence. You can search for them. You get about their maturity. We feature standards, and we also present the different regulations. So this is the system you can use free of charge. It's up to you to use it. We think it's smart. We think it can do a lot, and you can find it at.
Right. And to conclude this, I would like to thank you all very, very much for your time, for sharing your expertise. Peter Klimek, thanks a lot. And everyone else, I hope you found something interesting in these webinars, and we hope to see you again somewhere. Thank you very much. Goodbye.